Hello friends, this is Team SuperSimplified and today we are here with Economic Survey 2017, Chapter 11. The title of the Chapter 11 is One Economic India for Goods and in the Eyes of the Constitution. This chapter is here because GST is going to be implemented soon. The tentative date is 1st July 2017 and with GST we are trying to materialize the dream of One Economic India by making India a single market by ensuring uniformity of taxation across the country. And to pass GST Act, Constitution was also amended. Constitutional Amendment Act 101 was passed in the Parliament, right? So before starting the chapter, let's see what is the agenda here, what are the points we are going to discuss. So as we said in this chapter, our discussion is going to revolve around GST and the central point of discussion here will be trade within India. So we will discuss about One Economic India. Do we have One Economic India today? If not, then what are the reasons and how can we achieve this aim? Here we will see the internal trade pattern of India, interstate between the states and intrastate within the state. Then we will do a comparative analysis between different Indian states and then we will see where do we stand as per international standards, right? So this chapter is basically divided into two sections. In section 1 we will discuss the internal trade pattern of India, the volume of trade, how smooth and hassle-free is the movement of goods and people between the states and within the state, and we will discuss about the interstate and intrastate trade patterns, right? And then in the section 2 we will talk about the constitutional provisions related to economic integration. We will also see if there are any constitutional provisions which are hampering the creation of One Economic India. For example, the state's power to create own taxation rules, which eventually led to different states forming their own laws and which resulted in the segmentation of Indian market. So we will discuss on those lines, right? Then we will conclude the chapter and have a quick recap. So let's start the chapter now. So Economic Survey says that international integration is under siege. There is a wave of deglobalization, and it says this because after the recent financial crisis, the level of trade and investment between the countries is coming down. Countries are going for protective measures on the trade front, and the focus is moving from international market to the internal market within the country. The trend can be seen clearly in European Union. Some of the major countries have announced exit from EU, and this can be seen in US also. US is restricting free inflow of labor into its territory by altering its visa rules, which is going to hurt the Indian IT industry also, right? And China is also now focusing on its internal market and it is trying to utilize the potential of internal consumption as a growth engine, right? So a wave of deglobalization, though not very strong, but can be felt. So during this time when the international integration is coming down, India is on the verge of implementing a transformational reform called Goods and Services Tax with the motto One India, One Market, One Tax to integrate India as a single market. So is India not a single market today? Is it not integrated? What are the problems? So Economic Survey says that India is highly integrated internally with a considerable flow of people and goods, but still there are some lacunae which are to be addressed with the help of GST. And it mentions two interesting facts here related to trade in India. The first point is actually a comparison between interstate trade versus the international trade of India. So as per Economic Survey, interstate trade in India is 1.7 times more than the international trade. And the cross-border exchange between the firms amounts to 54% of GDP. And when we compare the interstate trade, the trade between the states, versus the intrastate trade, the trade within the state, then according to the observation by Economic Survey, the current system of indirect taxes favors interstate trade over the intrastate trade. So these are the two important facts about Indian trade pattern. Now in section 1 we will discuss about One India, internal trade in goods. So let's see what is the trade profile of India. So here we will compare India versus others on the international stage. India's aggregate interstate trade is 54% of GDP, but it is less than China and USA. For US the number is 78% and for China it is 74%. But it is more than Canada and EU. And India's trade profile is actually similar to China, whose internal trade is 1.6 times the international trade. For us this number is 1.7. But for US it is much higher. It is 2.5. And it is quite natural for the large countries to have a high interstate trade to GDP ratio because the size of their domestic market itself is huge. Whereas in the case of smaller countries, the international trade level is higher than the internal trade. And these are some of the figures here to support these observations. Here in the case of USA, the interstate trade to GDP ratio is 78%, whereas for India it is 54%. For China it is 74%, and in the case of Canada and European Union it is just 20%. But they have high international trade to GDP ratio, 62% and 84%, whereas it is only 32% for India and even for USA. So these are the large countries, India, USA, China, these are large countries. So they trade more internally within the country as compared to trading internationally with other countries, right? So this is an important observation here. So now let's come to the reasons why there's high interstate trade in India. So the first reason is area-based exemption. So Central Excise Act exempts manufacturing in certain states from excise duties. Northeastern states, Sikkim, Jammu and Kashmir, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh and Kutch in Gujarat, right? So this exemption creates a strong incentive to shift the real or reported production in these areas. So companies would like to establish their manufacturing units in these areas, these exempted areas, to bring down their cost of production, right? And another reason is the CST and VAT anomaly. So in the present indirect tax regime, what is happening here is state is charging VAT, value added tax, on the sale within the state. Okay, you manufacture something and you sell within the state, then you have to pay VAT to the state government. But if you are selling your product to a consumer sitting in another state, then it is interstate trade between two states, right? And this is outside the purview of the state. So VAT is not applicable in this case. In this case, what is applicable is another tax called CST, Central Sales Tax. And generally the rate of taxation of CST is much lower than VAT. So that is why interstate trade is more beneficial for the producers, right? So the point is, the present indirect tax regime is biased towards interstate trade. It promotes interstate trade indirectly. And we hope that once GST is implemented, it will eliminate these distortions, which will eventually lead to normalization in internal trade, right? Another reason is high manufacturing to GSDP ratio, gross state domestic product. So the states which are having high manufacturing activity, they sell this produce to the other states. That is why we see high interstate trade patterns. So these states import a lot of raw material from other states and they sell the final product to the consumer in other states, right? So that is why there is a high inflow and outflow of goods, which leads to high interstate trade. Now let's see what is the relationship between the interstate trade and manufacturing in the case of Indian states. So here on the y-axis we have trade as a percentage of GSDP, and on the x-axis we have manufacturing share of GSDP. So if we go on the extreme right side of this graph, then we have states like Goa, where the share of manufacturing in state GDP is very high, so around 40%. So manufacturing activity is constituting around 40% to the GDP of the state, and for such states the level of trade is also higher. And these states are like Goa, Himachal Pradesh, Gujarat, etc. Right? So in these states, manufacturing activity has a high share in the GDP of the state, and that is why the level of trade for these states is higher. And when we come to the other side of the graph, we have Bihar, Assam, Kerala. Here the manufacturing activity is low. For example, in the Bihar, it is mainly an agrarian state in the Ganga plains. So the manufacturing activity is low, and hence the level of trade is also low for these states. Right? So there is a strong correlation between a state's manufacturing share of GDP and its trade volumes. And some states have exceptional manufacturing share, for example, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, Goa. And the relationship is something like this: if there is a high manufacturing activity in the state, higher will be the interstate trade, right? And this particular figure of trade as a percentage of GDP is actually also a measure of openness of the state towards trading. So let's observe this graph. On the x-axis we have different states of India, and on the y-axis we have trade as a percentage of GSDP. So here the states like Uttarakhand, Goa, Himachal Pradesh, these are the top performers. For them, trade to GSDP ratio is very high. So these are kind of open states, they are open to trade. But when we come to Assam, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Kerala, all these states, they are closed to trade. The level of trade in these states is low. It is less than 20%, right? So the observation is that the most open states are Uttarakhand, Goa, Himachal Pradesh, etc. And the most closed states are Assam, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh. So the reason for exceptional performance of Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh is the exemption from the central excise tax for manufacturing. So this is also one of the reasons why these states are the top performers. Now high level of trade is okay, but actually there are two sides of the trade. There is export and import, and there should be a balance between these two aspects. So there's a formula for trade balance: export minus import, and the favorable proposition for any country or any state is export should be greater than import. So the trade balance number should be a high positive number. Okay. So economic survey says that the large manufacturing states like Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, they have a positive balance of trade because they are exporting more than importing, which highlights their competitive manufacturing capabilities. Okay. And even states like UP, Haryana also show positive balance due to some of the manufacturing powerhouses like Noida and Gurugram in the proximity of national capital, right? And the states like Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh and Goa, which were seen as the top performer in the previous slide because they trade maximum in India, these states show a trade deficit because they are importing more than what they are exporting. And the same thing is visible in this particular graph. On the y-axis we have the trade balance. If export is greater than import, then it will be positive, and when import is greater than export, then the trade balance will be negative. And on the x-axis we have different states. So here we can see that the states like Haryana, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, Gujarat, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, all these states have a surplus. They are exporting more than what they are importing. But the states like Uttarakhand, Goa, Himachal, Kerala, all these states are importing more than what they are exporting, right? Now let's see some of the factors which affect the trade pattern. These are some of the general factors, and they are relevant to the interstate trade within India also. So first thing is the distance. The cost of trade increases with distance. That is why the states which are distant tend to trade less. Then the state GSDP is also important. Higher the GSDP of importing and exporting states, higher is the level of trade between them. Then comes the proximity. This is quite obvious point. Adjoining states in India tend to trade with each other about 90% more than other states, right? And there is another factor which is language. So international trade observation is that the countries with shared languages tend to trade with each other more than with others. But in India, language is an insignificant factor. It is not a barrier to trade. So this is a good news, right? So these are the 4 factors which impact trade pattern between the Indian states. So the conclusion of section 1 is India's internal trade in goods seems surprisingly robust. This is true whether it is compared to India's external trade or internal trade of other countries. There is enormous variation across the states in their internal trade pattern. This we have seen. The smaller states tend to trade more, while the manufacturing states like Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra and Gujarat tend to have trade surplus. Right, they are exporting more than what they are importing. And it is a possibility that some proportion of India's internal trade could be a consequence of current tax distortions, which are likely to be normalized under the GST. Now let's come to section 2, One India Before the Law. Here basically we will see present scenario from the point of view of the constitution. What are the constitutional provisions present today in terms of the economic India? So economic survey says that one tax, one market and one India is possible only after GST, because there are some distortions present in the law presently which are not letting it happen. Presently there are many distortions, such as Indian states have levied large number of charges on goods and they hinder free trade in India. There are octroi duties, entry taxes, CST, etc. Right? So all these are actually segmenting the Indian market. And in the sector of agriculture also, if we see, then there are APMCs, Agriculture Produce Marketing Committee, which prevent the easy sales of agriculture produce across the states, and they deprive the farmer of better returns and higher incomes, and thus they reduce the agriculture productivity in India. So these are some of the anomalies present in the law today, right? So let's have a look at some of these provisions. Let's see what are the India's constitutional provisions with respect to the economic aspect. So Article 301 to 304 provide a layered set of rights and obligations for the state and the center. So Article 301 establishes the fundamental principle that India must be a common market, and it says that subject to other provisions of this part, trade, commerce and intercourse throughout the territory of India shall be free. Okay, so India must be a common market. So this is a constitutional provision itself. Then Article 302 to 304 qualify and elaborate on that principle. Article 302 gives Parliament the power to restrict free trade between and within the states on the ground of public interest. What is this public interest is very vague. Article 303A imposes a most favored nation type obligation on both the Parliament and the state legislatures. So it says that no law or regulation by either state or the center can favor one state over the other. Then Article 304A imposes a national treatment type obligation on the state legislatures. That is, no taxes can be applied to the goods originating in other state that are also not applied on the goods produced within the state. So you cannot create special taxes for the goods which are coming from other states if you are not having that tax for the goods produced within your own state. So this is a national treatment type obligation for the state legislatures. Then Article 304B allows the state legislatures to restrict the trade and commerce on the ground of public interest. So there is a power with the center also in Article 302 where they can restrict the free trade between or within the state on the grounds of public interest, and even states have that power, but they have to take the previous sanction of the president. That is another thing, but they are given the power to restrict free trade on the grounds of public interest. But this public interest is not very clear. It is up to the interpretation of the judiciary that what constitutes public interest actually. So the gist of these provisions is that both center and states have considerable freedom to restrict trade and commerce that hinder the creation of one India. That is why we have not achieved the dream of one economic India till now, because of these provisions. And financial levies, like we have discussed in the previous slide, the octroi, entry tax and all those different taxes created by the states, as well as some of the non-financial barriers imposed by the states, have become a major impediment to a common market, right? So finally, constitutional scheme of part 13, when read as whole, seeks economic integration while ensuring considerable leeway for the states to differentiate their own product from the other states. So finally, the objective is to create a common market, because the constitution itself says that there is a freedom of trade, commerce and intercourse, but there are some provisions which are actually conflicting with this goal. Now let's see what are the provisions in other countries. So if you talk about United States, then it has a very strong interstate commerce clause in the constitution, and it gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states of United States. And in the US Constitution, where residuary powers are reserved with the states are constitutionally barred from regulating interstate trade and commerce, as it was felt such power would fundamentally hamper free trade and movement. But in India, both the states and the center have these powers. And that is where the conflict is coming from. And when we talk about the European Union also, it is accepted that the countries within European Union must not restrict the 4 freedoms of movement: goods, services, capital and people. Now let's compare to the WTO laws also. So WTO imposes most favored nation and national treatment requirement, just as the constitution does, right? But the key difference with the constitution is the freedom provided to depart from these anti-protectionist measures. And the reasons for invoking departures from free trade or common market principles are more clearly and narrowly specified in WTO than in the constitution, because constitution refers to an open-ended statement on the grounds of public interest. We can depart from these principles of free trade, but in WTO these are very clearly defined. In WTO, the measure must not constitute arbitrary discrimination, must not be a form of disguised protectionism, and above all, it must be necessary. So it is the duty of the departing state to justify that the departure is actually necessary. So the point here is that even if India cannot embrace the strong standards and common market prevalent in the US and EU, law in India should at least aspire to weak standards of a common international market embraced by the countries around the world, right? So part 2 concludes that cooperative federalism is becoming an increasingly important governance dynamic, and reflecting this, the country has unanimously passed a landmark constitutional amendment to implement GST, which should result in a common market for domestic indirect taxes. And building on this, the country can go further and extend this principle of one economic India to other spheres as well. So it is a time for the constitutional to catch up to further facilitate this surging internal integration. Okay, so that's all in this chapter. Let's have a quick recap. So first of all, we saw that India is undergoing a major economic reform called GST with the motto of One India, One Market, One Tax, because the 4 freedoms in any economy are very, very important for its growth: the hassle-free movement of goods, services, capital and people. So GST is a step in this direction. And in the section 1, One India, internal trade in goods, we saw the trade profile of India. So India's aggregate interstate trade is 54% of GDP, and it is more than EU and Canada, but it is less than China and USA. And interstate trade in India is 1.7 times larger than the international trade, and that is because large countries tend to trade more internally because of the size of their internal market. And there's one more observation, that present taxation system favors interstate trade over intrastate trade because of CST VAT anomaly. And we have seen with the help of a graph that the level of trade across the Indian states vary, and the reason is openness of state towards trade and the government policies. And then we saw some of the factors affecting interstate trade, that is distance, the GSDP of the trading states, exporting and importing states, and the proximity of the states. The adjacent states tend to trade 90% more than the other states. And language is also a factor generally, but in case of India, language is not a barrier to trade, right? And in the section 2, we studied the constitutional aspect. What is the present scenario before the GST implementation? So here, center and states have considerable freedom to restrict trade and commerce, unlike other countries like US, where the states cannot interfere in interstate trade matters. But in India, that is possible, and that hinders the creation of one economic India. And the financial levies such as octroi, entry tax, and all those state level taxes, as well as non-financial barriers imposed by the states, have become a major impediment to a common market. So it is a time for the constitution to catch up to further facilitate this surging integration, right? So that's all, guys. That's all from our side in this particular chapter. If you like the video, please click on the like button. Please provide your feedback in the comment section, and please subscribe to the channel if you have not done so that you get regular notifications and you don't miss out anything important. And please share these lectures with your friends so that they can also take the benefit. We'll see you soon with the next chapter. Till then, bye bye, take care and prepare well.